School of Kokanee at 240 feet. Don't think I'll be getting to those with droppers. Every time I do a video at Chelan, lots of anglers get super confused because it'll be like winter or early spring and we'll be fishing kokanee at like 100, 120 feet, whereas like everywhere else in most conventional kokanee fisheries, and during the winter time and spring months, you're going to be fishing near the surface, typically top 20 foot of the water column. So people get really confused by Chelan kokanee. A lot of times people will say, oh, it's because the thermocline is so stable there that's why they're always deep, but that's not actually true. Chelan's a very weird lake in a lot of ways. It's super oligotrophic. In other words, it's very unproductive. And because of that, the water is just extremely clear. And so it's best to really think about Lake Chelan as actually two lakes. Each is very different. There is the lower basin, the Wapato Basin, which is smaller, and that's the basin that's around Chelan. And that's a more typical kokanee fishery in that, at least for periods of time in the spring and early summer, I can catch fish 30 feet deep, but sometimes I've seen them bust on the surface and long lined them and caught them on the surface in the spring in the Wapato Basin. But again, in the wintertime there, they drop to like 120, 80 feet quite commonly. So it's a little bit strange, but at least it does show a more typical like migratory pattern up and down through the water column. But the basin that I'm in here, which is the upper basin today, is the Lucerne Basin, is really weird. And it's weird because the Lucerne Basin has the largest seach in the world. And a thermocline seach is that basically what happens is the thermocline, because of the length of the lake and the winds that funnel down through here, the thermocline wobbles back and forth in the basin. And every couple days it'll go from one extreme to the other. And in fact, it's the largest seach in the world in that the thermocline here can vary as much as 100 feet on either end of it. Towards the middle, of course, it's more stable because that's the pitch point, right? Like that's the axis point which it's rotating. So it's more stable in the middle. But on the opposite ends, it can get really extreme. And people who swim here in the summertime know this, that on some days you can go down and the seach is so strong, the thermocline, the cold water thermocline, can come all the way to the surface and totally displace the warm water on the surface. And it can go up and down as much as 100 feet. So that's why sometimes when I'm fishing the Lucerne Basin, especially on the end, one day those kokanee are at 150 feet, and the next day they're at like 20. And it's because that seach is moving back and forth and changing the distribution of the thermocline every day. So it's a really interesting phenomenon, and this is the largest seach that's been documented in the world. But then again, like I said, even in the Wapato Basin in the wintertime, those kokanee are at 120 feet, 150 feet, and you're probably thinking, well, why is that? And this goes back to that original discussion I was talking about, in that this lake is so oligotrophic. It's very clear. In fact, they use Secchi disc readings on this lake, and it's very common for them to be able to see the Secchi disc at depths of 50 or 60 feet. So you can look down and see a tiny little white and black disc 60 feet straight down. The water clarity here is phenomenal, and that's because there's very little algae and there's almost no sediment suspended in the water column. So the eutrophic zone, that is the zone at which light penetrates and plankton can gather sunlight and undergo photosynthesis, extends way down there, right? And there's not a ton of nutrients, so there's not a huge concentration of plankton anywhere. And so those kokanee can just stay deep, right? Because there's really no advantage to coming up and feeding shallow in the water column, because it's dangerous to feed near the surface. You can get eaten by birds, you can get eaten by loons and things like that. And so they can just stay out in the middle, over deep water, suspended, and find basically the same quantity of food resources, and they can just hang there, and the water temperature is relatively stable down there. They don't have to risk coming up shallow to feed, like a lot of kokanee have to do in more eutrophic lakes where they're coming up shallower to find food resources because they don't have choice. So that's what makes this lake so weird, is the fact that it's really two lakes in one, and it's really unique in terms of its clarity compared to a lot of other kokanee lakes, and it's really low productivity, but it's so big that it can support lots of kokanee. So that's why Lake Chelan is such a weird kokanee fishery.